Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, May 31st, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Neva Parker, laboratory manager from White Labs, shares the results of an experiment she conducted and wrote about in Zymergy magazine. Neva put 3 yeast strains through the paces to see how they would perform at different temperatures and gravities. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. Well, this is the last episode before our little June hiatus. But don't worry, we'll return in a month with lots of good stuff, including stuff from the National Homebrewers Conference out in Denver in late June. But just taking the month off. Got a little bit of vacation in there, and they got the conference to go through in Denver, and it was just going to be a trick to put all that to stay on schedule. And I know that you appreciate, starting your Thursday mornings out with Basic Brewing Radio, and I didn't want to mess with that. I didn't want to throw you off. I also just wanted to take some time off. So anyway, let's pop into the mailbag. The pre-vacation mailbag to get us started off. John from Boise, Idaho writes with a tip for those who use Beersmith software and a Pocket PC. John says, in Beersmith you can select the Export As feature, which will open a selection window. In this window, select to save all recipes in selected view and in the web or custom format option. John says, I save this to a folder on my hard drive called Recipes. I also recommend selecting the Classic option from the drop-down, which will result in an ingredients and basic mash profile, etc. type format. This will create single HTML files for each recipe and a primary file that is a list of these recipes. John says, I then synchronize this directory to my Pocket PC. Once they are on my Pocket PC, I can open them with the web browser on that device, select the recipe that I want, and I have all the information handy. Then when I'm sharing a recipe or buying ingredients, I have the list of what and how much of each are needed. John says this also allows me to have all the information handy during club homebrew meetings while they taste my brews. Very handy. Nifty tip there. Thanks, John. Scott from Blacksburg, Virginia writes with one that's got me stumped, personally. Scott says, I have access to an inexpensive dry ice supply and have considered trying to use it to chill my wort. Are there any reasons not to do this? And is there anything in particular I should keep in mind if I do try it? Well, Scott, I've preached my preference on this program against using store-bought regular ice to cool wort down because of sanitation issues. But dry ice is something different. As I understand it, dry ice is essentially frozen CO2. When you put it into warm water, it goes straight from solid into carbon dioxide gas. And that process, going from solid to a gas, is called sublimation, one of the very few things that I remember from high school chemistry. Or is it physics? I don't remember where I learned it, but I remember the word sublimation. And it reminds me of the time I worked backstage at a concert, and that's how they made fog on stage. They dumped blocks of dry ice into these big drums of heated water and then hooked flexible hoses up to the drums to direct the fog where they wanted it to go. So other than being spooky, your brew pots, it's going to look like a witch's brew. I'm not sure what would happen if you put dry ice into recently boiling wort. I'd say approach it with caution because I don't know if the dry ice would, explode if the water was too hot. I don't know, but approach it with caution. Maybe try it out with a small batch first to see what happens. Intellectually, it sounds like it might work. It might cool down the wort and just evaporate away into the air. I don't know. I don't know how much you'd have to add to get it down to pitching temperature. Just a whole bunch of I don't know. It does sound fun, though. So, Scott, be careful with your inexpensive dry ice and let us know what happens, and I'll pass that on, in July when we get back. Eric from Lincoln, Nebraska writes with a mead-making story. Eric says, inspired by your first mead experiment, I decided to split up my first mead attempt into 5 small batches with different flavors for secondary fermentation: plain, jalapeno, strawberry, raspberry/blackberry, and chocolate mint. After a week, the jalapeno mead was crystal clear, but the plain one was still very cloudy. I had no idea jalapenos could have this effect. Eric says a much bigger difference than I've seen Irish moss make. And Eric sent me a picture, and sure enough, there was a cloudy mead sitting next to a very clear mead, and the yeast appeared to be cleaned right out. I know back in my college days, I'd eat batter-fried jalapenos at my favorite bar and grill, and I'd be cleaned out the next day. So, but thank you very much. I tell you. Anyway, thank you, Eric, for that interesting observation. I wonder if there's something in the oils of the jalapeno that do the trick. On to a serious email from Jeff in Grapevine, Texas. Jeff says, a question for you and your listeners, if I may, and you may, Jeff. I have recently been diagnosed with gout. The doctor, as well as pretty much any website that mentions gout, says I need to stay away from beer due to high purine levels from the malts and specifically the yeasts found in beer. In my quest for finding a way around this, aside from the old diet and exercise method, which may help, I've come across some articles referencing Kirin Tanrei Alpha Hapushu beer. I apologize to our Japanese-based listeners for the slashing of that pronunciation. Anyway, that beer is supposed to be a low purine beer from Japan, Jeff says. Is there a method to reduce or limit the amount of purines in my homebrew? Now, my dad went through a bout with gout not too long ago, and it was no laughing matter. It essentially causes a lot of pain in your feet and your lower extremities because of uric acid crystals, I believe, that concentrate in those areas. And, my dad had a hard time getting around for a while, just extremely painful. I hope that, Jeff, I hope that your case is not as bad as my dad's. But I've never heard of purines, but I wonder if anybody out there listening has heard of a way to modify homebrew recipes to minimize them. If you have, drop me a line. It won't be on the air for the next month, but I'll be glad to forward your note to Jeff and hopefully share the results when we get back. Well, good luck with the gout thing, Jeff. Now, on to another interview with somebody who knows way more than I do, which is 99% of the interviews that I do, which is a good thing because I'm not the expert here. I'm just a channel, just an empty tube. Neva Parker is a laboratory manager at White Labs Yeast, and I asked her to walk us through her article that appeared in the most recent issue of Zymergy magazine. Neva Parker, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you.
We've had David Logston from Yeast on quite a few times, and this is the first time that we've had somebody from White Labs on the podcast, and I'm not meaning to be preferential. It's just that David is so doggone accessible.
Well, I'm glad to be the first one that you've got on then.
And David does a great job as well. So, but it's always good to hear a new voice.
Well, thank you.
So you wrote an article in Zymergy magazine called Same Yeast, Different Flavor, How Changing Brewing Conditions Can Impact Your Yeast. And we've been talking about brewing experiments around here lately and conducting a few, but we don't have the knowledge, experience, or the tools that you have to do them properly. So first of all, give us some background on what you do and where you've come from and, just a little bit of your own personal history.
Sure. I actually went to college at Gonzaga University, which is in Spokane, Washington. It's a small Jesuit university. I just ended up there because I grew up in the Northwest in Oregon, and I wanted to stay close to home. And it was a small school, so I liked that. I had originally, my plan was to go to med school, actually, when I graduated from college, but I just decided to take a different route, and I landed in this job, and it was pretty fortunate for me that it's worked out, and, you know, I've been with White Labs for almost 5 years now, so I would say that I was pretty lucky just to get into this field. And it's been a good fit for, you know, both the company and for me. So I've been managing the lab for the last few years. And, you know, luckily for me, I have a lot of freedom to do these types of experiments and other kinds of trials and things like that. So it's been pretty exciting.
You know, I would imagine you've got a pretty important job at a yeast company.
Well, I try. Everybody's job is important here, but, you know, I just try to oversee and make sure things are running correctly so that we can get all that yeast out there.
Well, let's talk about your article. You said, in the opening sentence, you said, out of hops, malt, water, and yeast, yeast is the most easily influenced ingredient. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there's a lot of debate over what is the most important ingredient in brewing. And I would say that, you know, of course I'm a little bit biased because I work with yeast all the time, and I think it's pretty important. But as far as influence, you know, a lot of different factors can really change the way yeast performs because it's a living organism. You've got, you know, malt, water, hops, which are not really metabolically active like a yeast cell is. So the way we treat it is really important because they're live.
And they're so tiny that changes in their environment, even small changes in their environment, can really have a big effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, you know, generally we tend to forget that because, you know, it's hard to think that microscopically, but, you know, they are very small. So even changing the temperature, for instance, a couple of degrees can really, really impact the performance and just even the way they metabolize certain byproducts.
The way you measure, you concentrate. Well, talk about the structure of your experiments.
Sure. What I did was just used a basic brewing wort. I used it from the same batch. So we have a 20-gallon all-grain system that I brew on. So I made one batch. I split these up into different fermenters. The first experiment I did was based around changing the temperature of brewing. So fermentation temperatures were different. We've got 4 conical temperature-controlled fermenters, so I was able to really utilize those to, you know, hone in on the temperature that I wanted to ferment at. So all of the wort came from one batch. Made sure all the pitching rates were the same, so I followed the 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, and performed all my cell counts here in lab, and then just pitched the yeast during my brewing experiments. And then as far as the gravity measurements, those were just altered. I used DME just to alter the gravity readings, and those were also split batch. So I just tried to keep everything as consistent as possible as far as the variables. I just made sure that everything came from the same batch. All the yeast that was pitched came from the same culture so that viability was the same and the cell counts were consistent. So that was really important to me because, you know, a lot of times even pitch rate can change some of the outcome of beer. So I wanted to make sure at least that was a consistent part.
And we talked in our last episode with Chris Colby of Brew Your Own magazine about designing our own homebrew experiments, and part of what we talked about was limiting the variables. And like I said before, you really got the tools and the knowledge to do that, so that you know that the changes that you're observing in the results are going to be as a result of the variables that you're measuring.
Right, exactly. And I think that's really important, is to define what you want your variable to be, and then to figure out a way that you can make everything else be exactly the same except for that one thing.
Now, we generally say that fermentation, in fermentation, yeast takes sugar and makes alcohol and CO2. But there are other compounds that affect the flavor of the beer that the yeast can create as byproducts, and that's what you're really looking at as far as measuring the effects of these different conditions on the yeast, right?
That's right. That's right. I wanted to focus, there are probably hundreds of different byproducts that are produced during fermentation, but I really just wanted to focus on the, big flavor active compounds in this article.
And can you run through those for us?
The ones that I used were fusel alcohols, which are the higher alcohols. So I measured propanol and isoamyl alcohol, which are the most prevalent in beer, and then I did esters, and that was ethyl acetate and isoamyl acetate. And isoamyl acetate is the compound that's responsible for those sort of banana flavors in beer. And then I also wanted to measure a diacetyl, which can be really important because typically you don't really want high levels of diacetyl in your beers.
And the diacetyl can give you a butterscotch or a buttered popcorn flavor.
That's right. And
then the higher alcohols can give you describe the flavors that you'd get off of
the
those.
higher alcohols tend to give harsher flavors. In fairly low quantities, they're really undetectable just by the average person's taste buds. So their threshold levels are actually quite high as far as when you can taste them. But if they're in large quantities, they can produce a really harsh alcohol bite and almost an astringency. And then ethyl acetate, I already mentioned isoamyl acetate is that banana character. Ethyl acetate also can produce a sort of harsh solventy taste. That's something that's probably most prevalent in, Belgian beers, lambics, things like that are produced with Brett cultures because they produce high levels of ethyl acetate. So that's sort of that nail polish kind of solvent.
Now let's talk about, you ran 3 different yeast strains through the test. Tell us what strains that you picked and why you picked them.
Let's see. I used a California ale, which is our WLP001. I used a Trappist ale yeast, and then I used a German lager. I used the California just because it's California. It's our most popular strain. I really wanted to see how it would be impacted by some of these conditions because generally the strain is really clean, fermenting, pretty neutral as far as flavor compounds go. So I was just curious, if I altered some of these conditions, if that would change. And then I used the Trappist because it's a pretty high ester producer. So again, I just wanted to see the differences between the different variables and how that would alter the amount of esters and other products that were being produced with that yeast. And then I did the lager. I've heard that a German lager yeast that's fermented at higher temperatures can produce lots of esters, and I do know of some people that have used that particular strain to brew beer de gardes and things like that are, fairly cold fermented but are a little bit estery. So again, just wanted to measure some of the levels of esters and also see the impact of diacetyl levels with the lager strains at different temperatures.
You have 2 ale yeasts and 1 lager yeast, so you picked 2 sets of temperatures to put those yeast through the test.
I had originally started with 3 different temperatures. That's what I had wanted to do. So with the ale yeast, I also, in my article, I included the information for 68 and 75, those fermentation temperatures. I had originally started also with 62, but I didn't find much of a difference between 62 and 68. So I just kind of excluded that. And part of the reason, I think, is because those temperatures are fairly cool for those strains. So I wanted to show a bigger difference, so I changed the temperatures just a little bit. And
probably in an article like this, you want to kind of pare down the information that you deliver.
Right. It just ended up being a lot, and even as it was, it just felt like it was a lot of information. So I kind of wanted to focus some of that a little bit.
it helps to have the charts.
Yeah, and even if you don't really understand exactly what all these numbers mean, I think just having the bars there and just being able to see physically the differences was really helpful. So I hope that readers got something out of it.
Well, I certainly did. There was one shocker that I'll mention shortly, but in looking at the ale fermentations at 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and I apologize to our international listeners who I don't have those. Do you have the Celsius conversions on the tip of your tongue?
Don't. I could probably guess at it. It's probably going to be, around 20 Celsius, and 75 is probably about 27 Celsius, 25. I'm really not sure.
That'll give us a ballpark and maybe prevent some emails. So at least we're thinking about them. But what did you find, were there any surprises with the ale strains at those temperatures?
I wasn't really too surprised. I was actually hoping for a bigger difference between the two temperatures. That's what I was expecting. So as far as the results, it was pretty much what I figured it would be. But I was just surprised at how little the changes were.
And describe what you found with those two strains.
Well, with both strains, each of the fusel alcohols and ester compounds increased with increasing fermentation temperature, which was, pretty predictable. As far as that goes, generally when you're promoting more yeast growth, you get more of those byproducts being produced, and that's what we see here. And then as far as the diacetyl levels went, again, with the increasing temperatures, the diacetyl decreased, which was also, something that I was expecting because the temperature really promotes the yeast to uptake that diacetyl. So even though a lot of diacetyl is being produced during fermentation, the yeast really takes it back up again, and it's promoted by those higher temperatures. And
in looking at the chart, I don't know if it was because of the scale, but it seems to be quite a fairly large difference in the diacetyl levels between the two temperatures.
Absolutely.
I mean, it looks like it looks like you should be tasting just nothing but butterscotch with the 68 degree fermentation, but you're not.
Right. And typically, this range is actually parts per million, which is milligrams per liter. And I think a lot of what we see here is some of the other flavor compounds kind of overtaking some of those diacetyl flavors, especially in the higher fermentations. But again, I didn't have time to age these beers or, let them go through maturation or anything like that before I ran these numbers. So, that could have something to do with it as well.
And then in the Trappist strain, the amount of isoamyl acetate was just a little bitty blip, but yet it makes such a dramatic impact on the flavor of the beer.
It does make a big difference. And that's part of the reason I wanted to include, the flavor threshold levels. So those are the levels at which, these compounds are detected by people that are tasting beer. And isoamyl acetate has a flavor threshold that's very, very low. So even in really small quantities, it's easy to pick it up. So it's just one of those compounds that you don't need a lot of it, but you can really taste it or smell it.
And I guess we haven't mentioned, how are you measuring these compounds?
We actually have an instrument called a gas chromatograph. So I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's a machine that we load a sample into a vial. It heats up the sample, causing all of these flavor compounds to turn into gases so that they're volatile. The gases are run through a column, and the machine measures the levels of certain compounds that are in the sample.
So not something that I would have in my basement.
No. Probably not, unless you're a scientist.
Let's look at the lager fermentations. You did 55 degrees Fahrenheit and then 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is where I really had some questions. Describe what you found with this set of temperatures.
Still pretty similar with the ale strains. Again, as the temperature went up, the flavor compounds also increased. So compared to 55 to 68, the 68-degree fermentations had higher levels of flavor compounds. There wasn't any isoamyl acetate, the banana flavors, detected in this beer. But the biggest difference, I think, that we see with the lager strain is the drop in diacetyl between 55 and 68. So it's significantly lower in the 68-degree fermentation than it is in the colder fermentation.
Yeah, and this kind of popped a bubble that I'd been bouncing around in my head. I had grown to understand, and I'm not sure where or how, but grown to understand that if you brought your wort, your lager wort, down to lagering temperature, say 55 degrees or 50 degrees, and then pitched at that point, and kept your fermentation temperature at lagering temperatures, that a diacetyl rest was not as necessary as if you had started out with a higher temperature and then ramped it down once fermentation had begun. But this seems to blow that out of the water.
Well, the difference really is if you're going to pitch cold and maintain the same temperature throughout, you're probably going to have to let the beer go through that fermentation longer because it's going to take the yeast longer to really take that diacetyl back up. So both of these fermentations went the same amount of time. So I have no doubt that the 55-degree fermentation, would have decreased in diacetyl had I let it go through a lagering period or a secondary with the yeast being, able to really uptake that diacetyl. But just in this time frame, of course, the warmer fermentation is going to promote more diacetyl uptake, which is why it's so much lower. But typically, you can ferment cold, and then towards the end of fermentation, you can raise your temperature 5 degrees or so, and that'll help promote some of the diacetyl also to get taken back up by the yeast. So just doing a diacetyl rest towards the end of your fermentation will help decrease those levels.
How long was this fermentation for the test?
It was 1 week. Since the gravities were fairly low, the fermentations went pretty quickly. So
that's not an overly long.
No, not at all.
So maybe with a typical strategy for lager fermentations, you would see a decrease in the difference between the amount of diacetyl produced at those two different temperatures.
Yeah, typically. And, over time, the colder fermentation will also have a decrease in diacetyl. It's just going to take a little bit longer. I know a lot of people who brew lagers and just let them go for, 3 weeks. And that's sufficient time to really get your diacetyl levels down. But again, you can also do a diacetyl rest, which makes it go a little bit quicker, just bumping up the temperature for a couple of days. That should take care of it.
At the end of active fermentation.
Right.
You got to be able to catch that. That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's generally the problem. And also, just to address what you were talking about with pitching it warm, that is more an issue of having enough yeast to start fermentation. So sometimes if you are under pitching your lager a little bit, because normally you would want to pitch a little bit more than you would for an ale yeast, we recommend pitching warm and then turning the temperature down once fermentation starts to get active. And that's just to help the yeast begin so that you don't have a long lag time with those lager fermentations if you're pitching a little bit lower.
Well, lager fermentations are definitely trickier than ale.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, that certainly answers at least some of my concern or question there. So it looks like if you are patient with your primary fermentation in your lager, you can be less worried about diacetyl levels. Or if you want to be more safe, you can raise the temperature for 5 or 10 degrees at the end of active fermentation, and that'll take care of it.
That's it.
Now, the second half of your experiments was testing how these three yeast strains functioned with a low gravity wort, a normal gravity wort, and a high gravity wort. And what now your high gravity wort is not as high gravity as some are used to out there in our listening audience.
No, certainly not. I didn't want to get too crazy. I was a little bit worried about, pitching correctly and aeration and things like that with a high gravity wort. So I didn't want to get it to the point where it was just going to be a difficult fermentation. I still wanted it to finish out at a normal pace. So that's why I kept it towards the low end of high gravity, I guess you could say.
So what are your numbers that you're calling low and normal and high?
My low gravity was 1030. What I called the normal gravity was 1044. And then my high gravity was 1070.
And I can picture people who have been writing to me saying, "Oh, that's nothing."
It's nothing. No, it's not. And actually, the parameters are fairly close to each other. But I was surprised to find how big the difference actually was just between those three, variable gravities.
And as you might predict, as the temperature went up, the production of these fermentation byproducts went up too.
Absolutely.
Or not the temperature, the gravities. I'm sorry.
Yes.
And it's interesting to compare the charts of the different, between the strains. Like for instance, again, the White Labs 500, the Trappist ale yeast, its isoamyl acetate again. Was quite a bit higher than the other two.
Right. Yeah, the other two actually didn't have any detectable levels of isoamyl acetate, so I was a little disappointed to see that, but I suppose it makes sense for those strains. That's part of the reason I wanted to run the Trappist, because I knew that it would have some of those compounds. And, you can see really the differences in how much isoamyl acetate is being produced just by bumping up the gravity a little bit.
And as you said, the California ale yeast was very clean as far as that compound was concerned, and then the German lager yeast was as well. I mean, just like no isoamyl acetate, even at the high gravity. So again, we're seeing that just varying that one variable really changes the character of your beer.
That's right. And I was actually surprised again, at the levels of differences here between the gravity. I was actually expecting larger differences with the temperature changes, so I was really surprised at how much these compounds changed just with varying gravity.
Yeah, it looks like you're really, with the higher gravities, you're really getting a bigger bump with the harsher alcohol flavors with
absolutely.
The Trappist.
And, I think that has to do with several different factors with the gravity changes. We're adding more sugars, obviously, so there's a little bit more substrate available there, but also more nitrogen in the form of free amino nitrogen. So we're increasing gravity of the wort, and we're increasing the amount of nitrogens that are present. So that has a real effect on how much of these products are being produced.
Now, do you anticipate that if you were to, say, use a yeast nutrient and add that to your higher gravity worts, do you think that would have any influence on these compounds?
I don't think there's probably going to be a whole lot of influence as far as the production of these compounds go. I think the yeast nutrients are probably more going to affect the yeast themselves, the yeast cell walls, and the building of components for producing more cells. And I guess in that way you could see a little bit more of a bump in these products, but I think the cell's probably going to be so focused on growing and building up more cells than it is in actually undergoing metabolism and actually producing a lot of these byproducts.
So you did sensory tests?
Yes.
Did the sensory tests go along with what you measured with the gas chromatograph?
Yeah, Yeah, they did, and I was really happy about that. I just going back to, writing the article and having all these charts, I wanted something that would make sense to people. And, being able to see these levels is great, but how does that translate actually into the flavor of my beer? So I just pulled together a panel of people, some with experience at tasting beers and others not with so much experience. So it was nice just to get a diversified group and just had them describe some of the flavor compounds and aroma compounds that they detected in these beers. And, I was happy with the results. It actually followed quite well with the actual numbers that we got here.
Now, I can't remember if we've covered this, but on the 3 gravities, did you vary your pitch rate along?
I did, yes. And I followed just the normal 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato pitch rate.
So it wasn't that you were under-pitching the higher gravity?
Right. Yeah, I wanted to keep the pitch rate consistent, so I just stuck with that rule. So when I pitched the higher gravity beers, I pitched a little bit more yeast.
So what can we take away from this? I mean, if you're a brewer out there and you're listening to this, what can if they can't see the charts, what's and I would advise getting a copy of the magazine and reading it. I mean, you need to subscribe to Zymergy anyway if you're a home brewer, but as well as BYO, and I do. I subscribe to both, so I practice what I preach. But if you're listening and you want to kind of give a bottom line to the brewers out there, what would it be?
Well, just to remember that, certain variables, particularly here, the fermentation temperature and the original gravity, can play a really significant role in the final outcome of your beer. So depending on, the styles that you're brewing, what kind of flavor compounds you're looking for, you can really use these as a tool to really, make the beer exactly how you want it. If you're looking to increase some esters, you can increase the gravity or temperature to promote some of that production, or if you're trying to keep those things down. So, I think this really gives you an opportunity to play around with the beer and have some background information on how you can do that and really make it what you want.
And I think that's one of the most satisfying things about brewing is that there's so many variables that you can play with.
Absolutely, and there's so many more, besides this. But I chose these two, because they're fairly easy for a brewer to control. So gravity is something that you can definitely play around with. Temperature, hopefully, you have a way to monitor that, and also just, so that people realize that fermentation temperature is important, and it can keep your beer consistent if you can really maintain and control that temperature.
Yeah, in the beginning when I started brewing, I thought my job was over when I pitched the yeast in the bucket. But that's only half the equation.
Exactly. People don't pay enough attention to the fermentation side.
Says the lab manager.
They should. It's very important.
Well, I appreciate your work on this article, and I appreciate your coming on to fill us in.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks again to Neva Parker of White Labs. Zymergy is a publication of the American Homebrewers Association, and you can learn more about the AHA at beertown.org. And again, a very well-done publication and very helpful to me in getting ideas and information. We're in the home stretch here in this pre-vacation episode. Remember, lots of stuff from the National Homebrewers Conference in Denver coming up when we get back. I hope to see you there. If you see us wandering around, please flag us down and say howdy. Also, after the vacation, a scientific-type episode that I'm really looking forward to, thanks to the help of a couple of listeners out there. You know who you are. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop, where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process, step by step, from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all-grain process, from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And you'd just be amazed at how easy it is once you see it done. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online from us, and I'll pack it up and send it to you. I'm still getting orders for our Go Forth and Flocculate shirt, so remember, if you've got one, send us your photo for our online gallery of our shirt wearers. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. And I remembered to look up the products this week. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are the Humminbird SmartCast RF15 Wireless Remote Fish Finder and the Queasy Pro Dunvier Electronic Yogurt Maker. If you enjoy electronic yogurt, that may be the machine for you. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what on that link thing, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we'll get a teeny sliver of that sale amount. We appreciate your support, everybody. That's all until next month. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson, who is in Austin, did our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. Have a good June, everybody. So long.